for this World War II unit, the years that we need to get to understand the time frame, we actually need to start with the year 1939. And this is when World War II breaks out in Europe. And just a little note up underneath that, this is the year that Hitler invades Poland. There's a lot of stuff that happens before this, leading up to this war, that we'll cover inside of this unit. But ultimately, on September 1st of 1939, Hitler invading the country next to him of Poland is going to be what kickstarts this war in Europe. And just like we did in World War I, we are going to declare ourselves neutral. Again, because we follow that policy of isolationism. So for 1939, another important date is going to be specifically December 7th, 1941. This is going to be the U.S. involvement. And this is going to come from the attack at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. Japan's going to attack us there. Congress is going to meet, and within 24 hours of this attack, we will be declaring war on Japan. And Japan being in an alliance with Germany and Italy, we find ourselves fighting not only against Japan in the Pacific, but against Germany and Italy in Europe. And ultimately, what is going to bring an end to this war is going to be the year 1945. We're going to have what's called VE Day, which is Victory in Europe. So the war is going to be over in Europe, and then we're going to have VJ Day, which is Victory over Japan, which ultimately is going to lead to their surrender after we drop the atomic bombs on them. So there's a lot of important stuff in this unit, and it's just going to take some time. This is a crucial part of your state test, World War II, civil rights, things like that. So there's a lot of stuff here. You need to be familiar with like the guys, the men within this unit, okay? Joseph Stalin is going to be the dictator of the Soviet Union. He's going to pretty much come in after Vladimir Lenin dies, and he's going to be that new communist dictator. Mussolini is going to be our fascist leader of Italy. Hideki Tojo is going to be our military dictator of Japan. He's the military dictator, but please remember, there is an emperor, and his name is Hirohito. But ultimately, Japan is going to be ruled by that military dictator, Hideki Tojo. And then the most infamous of them all, of course, is Adolf Hitler. We know that Adolf Hitler, go ahead and jump into one of the most, again, infamous events throughout World War II is the Holocaust. And there were actually steps to what he called the final solution, which is the extermination of the Jewish people. At first, these Jews were discriminated against, especially through things like the Nuremberg laws. And it's really good to note here that these Nuremberg laws that kept them from marrying German citizens, they had to wear the little Yellow Star of David. There were all these discriminatory rules against Jews in Germany. This is going to be very similar to our Jim Crow laws that we had against African Americans in southern states. So there's a similarity there. We're also going to see a major event called Kristallnacht, and this is where Hitler's secret police, the Gestapo, they're going to actually lead raids throughout Austria and throughout Germany on Jewish communities. And, they're going to burn down some synagogues, which are their churches, destroy some Jewish businesses and things like that. The next one is we're going to see he's actually going to tell Jews they need to get out. They need to leave Germany. They're not welcome. He's going to encourage them to leave. Some are going to board a ship called the St. Louis, and they're going to attempt to come to America. It's important for you to know why they were not accepted. And this goes back to our Roaring Twenties unit, where we had laws limiting or setting a quota on immigration. And we claim to have met the number of immigrants from Germany that were going to be allotted for that year. So a lot of the Jews that were aboard that ship were forced to turn around, and many of them are going to be dying later on in these concentration camps that Hitler creates. The next step, he's going to segregate them in ghettos, and that's pretty much just going to make it easier for when it does get time for him to decide to put them in concentration camps and labor camps and things like that. They're going to be easier to round up. And then, of course, his ultimate final solution is going to be the extermination of the Jewish population. And he wipes out a large percentage of the Jewish population, especially in Eastern and Southern Europe, with what we all know as the Holocaust. That's what we call it. And this is an example of genocide. Again, this is what he calls the final solution, which is the attempted extermination of the Jewish population. Over here, that group that we created the idea of, our president did, Woodrow Wilson created the idea of a League of Nations teaming up, working together to prevent war. And the sad thing is, again, a little review here, the U.S. was not a part of this. We did not sign the Treaty of Versailles. We did not want to join the League of Nations. And when I say we, I specifically mean the U.S. Senate, because joining the League of Nations, how it operated, would have taken the power to declare war away from Congress. And they did not want that, obviously, the Senate being part of the U.S. Congress. But the League of Nations, their job is to kind of hold countries accountable, to follow these rules, and to make sure that war, like World War I, did not break out again. So these are going to be their failures. Italy invaded Ethiopia. It says in 1931, Japan invades a place called Manchuria. And I keep doing that. Manchuria, and Manchuria is full of natural resources that Japan needs for their industries and to fuel their military, so on and so forth. Hitler is going to expand his military. Now, the significance with this, and I want you to write it, this is a clear violation of, we're going to shorten it up, the Treaty of Versailles. He is only supposed to have 100,000 troops, and he is going to hold a military draft not long after he is named Chancellor of Germany in about, I think it's 1932. So again, the League of Nations, the leaders, I'm going to write them down up here, are Britain and France, since we didn't join. And they're the ones that are kind of responsible for seeing these events and seeing how they should not be taking place and gathering up the League of Nations to take action to stop any further aggression or violation of rules. And they're not. They don't do anything. Something else that Hitler's going to wind up doing is he's going to wind up annexing his home country, actually. He's from Austria. He's going to invade the Rhineland, which is right here. I'm just going to put a dot in Germany. This little border between Germany and France is the Rhineland that France had possession of in order to help kind of accommodate for the lack of reparations that Germany couldn't afford. And then another one, they're actually going to be given the Sudetenland. And the Sudetenland is a little bitty part of Czechoslovakia, about right there. And this happens over here with the Munich Conference. As the League of Nations is seeing all these things take place between Italy invading Ethiopia, Japan invading Manchuria, Hitler expanding his military, invading the Rhineland, and now he's talking about wanting the Sudetenland, which is part of Czechoslovakia. That part of Czechoslovakia actually used to belong to the German Empire. The people who live there, they speak German. They used to be German citizens. So Hitler is claiming that he simply wants to reunite his German-speaking people under one nation. So to give him a little bit of credit, that does make sense. But the Munich Conference here, it says who attended. This is very important. The leaders of the League of Nations. We've got Chamberlain, He's the Prime Minister of Britain. You can think of him as kind of being the president. We have Daladier here. He's going to be the representative for France. The two leaders, again, Britain and France, of the League of Nations, they're going to sit down with Adolf Hitler. And they're basically going to tell him, okay, we have let you get away with all of these things. We've let you do all these things that you're not supposed to do. And now you're claiming that you want a piece of Czechoslovakia known as the Sudetenland. And so they basically give Hitler the opportunity at this conference to lay down his demands. Like, what do you want? Tell us everything now, because people are starting to get nervous. They're starting to get nervous about all these actions that everybody's doing, and we just want to make sure we clear the air. And so Hitler claims that all he wants is the Sudetenland. That if he was given the Sudetenland and he was given those German-speaking people, previous German citizens back, that he would be satisfied. So, Britain and France, Chamberlain and Daladier, they follow, and this is so very important, a policy of appeasement. They decide to appease Hitler, to give him the Sudetenland, give him that part of Czechoslovakia, in order to keep him happy so that we can prevent war. So when they leave this conference, the understanding is Hitler has annexed Austria. He now has the Rhineland back under his possession. He was just given the Sudetenland, and he is happy. He is satisfied. We're not going to see any more talk or aggression towards locations outside of Germany. And then, like Hitler is good at, lying, 6 months later, after this conference where he is supposed to be satisfied, we're actually going to see Hitler invade the rest of Czechoslovakia. He takes more than Sudetenland. He takes the whole country under his possession. And yet again, the League of Nations fails to take adequate action. Over here, this whole page right here, there's a lot of stuff here. You've got to understand how America goes from being very, very neutral to like, we are adamant that we are not going to be involved in this conflict in Europe, to where we start to realize, okay, we may need to do a little something to help our friends, specifically Britain, to the point to where we are almost fully involved in this war, especially with producing weapons and things. So our neutrality is going to change. It's going to evolve from being completely out of this war to we're starting to step off into it a little bit more. And to be honest with you, one thing to note here, something that FDR did with our neighboring countries is he established what's called the good neighbor policy. One thing I always tell my classes is the thing about Europe, if you look at European history, it's war after war after war after war after war. Europeans like to fight. That's one of the reasons we have always wanted to follow a policy of isolationism up until this point. And so, seeing all the drama and the conflict that Europe has with all of the countries and the surrounding neighbors and stuff, we're going to look at the countries that surround us, and we don't want that same relationship. But Franklin Roosevelt's cousin, Teddy Roosevelt, back when he was president in the early 1900s, he created a kind of a bully relationship with Latin America with his gunboat diplomacy, where we have stationed battleships all throughout Latin America, not only to keep Europeans out, but also to kind of keep our thumbs down on those Latin American countries. Again, kind of like a bully, and Latin America doesn't like it. So to prevent the relationship that Europe has from happening with us and our neighbors, he creates the good neighbor policy, where he's actually going to meet with some Latin American officials, and we're going to withdraw those gunboats that had been placed there since the early 1900s with his cousin Teddy. Something else that we did in the 1930s, so actually during the Great Depression, is we passed a series of neutrality acts. And the reason we get these neutrality acts is because of an investigation held by what is known as the Nye Committee. When we studied World War I and we looked at, well, why did we declare war in World War I? We summed it up to unrestricted submarine warfare, that Germany broke the Sussex Pledge and continued sinking ships without warning. But then, after World War I was over and throughout the Roaring Twenties and the Great Depression, people actually began to question whether or not that was the real reason. Was there a motive outside of that? Maybe by people who are going to make money, the banks and the businesses in America, if we go to war, were they encouraging our involvement out of greed? Because during war, banks are going to make money by making loans. Big industries that are producing war equipment, they're going to make a ton of money. So there is a motive there for them to encourage our involvement. So the Nye Committee kind of determined that banks and businesses, I want to write those down, banks and businesses encouraged our involvement in World War I. So, to prevent that from happening, to make sure that we actually stay neutral throughout the Great Depression, and while all of those things were going on, like Hitler annexing Austria and Italy invading Ethiopia, we passed laws to make sure that we remain neutral in case war breaks out. And the name of the laws, I love it when this happens, gives it away. They're called the Neutrality Acts. And so ultimately, the Neutrality Acts state that you cannot sell any war equipment to a belligerent nation, so any country at war, and also that you cannot loan any money. So there we go. We're taking care of those banks and those businesses that were greedy in World War I and encouraging our involvement. Now they know that they can't make any money. So we're not going to be selling any war equipment. We're not going to be making any loans to any country that is at war. It's going to decrease our chances of our involvement. And then the third Neutrality Act is going to go farther than just saying one country at war with another we cannot sell or loan money to. We're actually going to say even if a country is experiencing a civil war, they can't do that either. And this was necessary because of the country of Spain. There was a fascist rebellion going on in Spain that was being backed up by Hitler and Mussolini. We would not have supported the fascists. We would have supported the other side, which could have drawn us into a conflict with Germany and Italy. So we couldn't even sell or loan money to the people of Spain either. And then in August of 1939, this is so important, we're going to see that Hitler and Stalin are going to make a very, very unusual agreement. Hitler being fascist and Stalin being communist, it is extremely unlikely that they would have any relationship whatsoever, any relationship involving trade, any peaceful relationship, period. And what we see is they hold a meeting, okay, where they send representatives to, and the non-aggression pact is signed between their two countries. And the non-aggression pact, again, the name gives it away. This is when Germany and the Soviet Union are promising to not go to war with one another. And this kind of shook everybody because, again, this is a very unlikely friendship that is being sparked here. But the reason that Hitler pursues this relationship with Stalin is because he's about to invade Poland. And Poland is between him and the Soviet Union. So he wants to make sure that when he invades Poland, that the Soviet Union didn't feel that they were a threat and they wouldn't attack, because that would have forced Hitler to fight on two fronts, all right? So, important, actually, there was a secret agreement in the Non-Aggression Pact, and this secret agreement is that Hitler's about to invade Poland from the west, Stalin can invade from the east, and the secret agreement is we'll just split Poland between us. which kind of made sense because when Poland was created after World War I, half of Poland used to belong to Germany, and then the other half used to belong to the Soviet Union. There was land taken from both countries, and Stalin's going to agree to this, okay? So they signed the non-aggression pact. Hitler, knowing that he does not have to worry about fighting a two-front war because of this non-aggression pact, he is going to invade Poland. And he knew when he started to talk about Poland, Britain and France tell him, hey, look, man, you invade Poland, that's it. We're actually going to declare war. We know that the League of Nations hasn't done anything at all up until this point about all those things that were illegal and all those things that you did. But we're going to make sure you understand, you step foot in Poland, Britain and France, we're coming for you. So Hitler knows that he's going to have Britain and France at his back. He wants to make sure that he can sweep through Poland very quickly and not have to be fighting the Soviet Union at the same time when he gets through Poland. So he invades Poland. And so all of these events, if you can see, I'm going to kind of circle the events that change our neutrality. And that's the first one. Okay? World War I has started. Britain and France declare war on Hitler. And we're going to realize that our neutrality acts, that's not going to work anymore. We're going to have to help. So we actually do some things. In 1939, we're going to create what's called the cash and carry policy. And what that is we will sell war equipment, which goes completely against the neutrality acts. Our Congress are going to amend or change those acts, allowing businesses to actually sell specifically to Britain. Britain and France, they can buy war equipment from us, but the catch is, and the name gives it away, they have to pay cash for it, and they have to come pick it up themselves and carry it back. Now, the reason we don't want to put this war equipment on our ships is we're looking back to World War I with the unrestricted submarine warfare. It is likely that if we put war equipment on ships and we haul it to Europe ourselves, U-boats are going to start sinking our ships, and it's going to encourage our involvement in the war. So we're still kind of trying to stay out of it at this point, but we realize our friends need help. Another thing, after cash and carry, especially Britain, is going to be struggling a little financially. They're not going to be able to pay a lot of cash anymore. We're going to realize they need some battleships, but they can't afford them. We're going to make a trade. They're not going to buy anything. We're actually going to give them, I believe it was 16 destroyers. They weren't any of our newest battleships, but they were still pretty effective. We're going to give Britain, and they needed it because they were an island, we're going to give them 16 destroyer battleships. And in exchange for that, they give us land for military purposes, okay? So instead of any money being exchanged here, it's called the barter system, where you're trading one product for another product. And then we're going to see, and this is, again, I feel like I keep saying that, and I apologize, but it is. We're going to see FDR is going to do something that's never done before. We are technically not at war, but he is going to get Congress to pass the Selective Service Act. We're going to start drafting soldiers. Now, what that shows you is that FDR knows things are escalating in Europe. At this point, Hitler has taken over Poland. He's invading France. It's not going to take him long to take over France. His military strategy, known as Blitzkrieg, he is conquering nations left and right, literally at the speed of light. So we're going to go ahead and start preparing, because it looks like we're probably going to wind up getting involved. So we say, important right here, that you know that this is the first time we have held a peacetime draft. We're drafting soldiers and we're training them, and we're not even in a war yet. So, moving on to a major event that, again, we realize after this event we've got to get more involved. We've got to get less neutral. Hitler takes over France. France was a part of the Allies, and at this point, France, when they fell, the only country standing opposed to Hitler and Mussolini is Britain. So the only person standing against them is Britain, and we cannot let Britain fall. Now, to get us ready and to get Americans' minds ready for the fact that we are probably fixing to have to get into this conflict, FDR gives the Four Freedoms speech. And this is so, so, so important. There it is again. He's actually preparing Americans. We're fixing to have to move out of isolationism. We're fixing to have to move away from that. We got to stay out of all the drama, and we're probably going to have to start getting involved in these conflicts to prevent them from being big conflicts like World War I and World War II, like we see right here. So the Four Freedoms speech, talking about the four basic freedoms that everybody should have, and those freedoms are being denied by people like Mussolini, Hitler, and Hideki Tojo in Japan. So, stepping up our game to help especially Britain. They're the only ones standing against Germany at this point. They are also the only ones that they're running out low on funds. Sorry, I got a little rambled there. So we actually can't do the cash and carry policy anymore. They don't have the money. So we're going to do now what's called the Lend-Lease Act. And the thing about the Lend-Lease Act is now we're going to be carrying these products on our own ships. They no longer have to pay cash. They no longer have to carry the products on their boats. So what this is going to do is this is going to open up opportunities for German U-boats to attack us. And to be honest with you, that's probably what FDR wanted. We need a reason. We need a reason for Congress to declare war. And if unrestricted submarine warfare was a good enough reason for World War I, then it can be a good enough reason for World War II as well. And to go on to talk about this, at this time, there's an important event that you need to know that Hitler does that shocked nobody. Hitler breaks that non-aggression pact and invades the Soviet Union. He invades the Soviet Union, so that non-aggression pact has been thrown out, and the Soviet Union will actually join the Allies with us later. All right, so that was a very, very bold move for Hitler. Now, right down here with the Atlantic Charter, again, we haven't declared war yet. Atlantic Charter is going to be a meeting between FDR and the new Prime Minister of Britain, and his name is Winston Churchill. And they meet on a ship, and they sign this document that becomes known as the Atlantic Charter. And in this meeting, what they talk about is that there does need to be a peacekeeping organization. The League of Nations didn't do their job, so it needs to be different. And so they actually talked about creating something that will be called the United Nations. And then they also just talked about what they need to do after this war is over to make sure that, yet again, this does not happen again. So this is, again, kind of bold of us. We're not even involved in this war yet. And FDR is planning a positive outcome when this war is over, victory for Britain and probably us once we get involved, obviously. And what we're going to do after this war, again, to make things better. So that's what the Atlantic Charter is. Now, I think that we believed that we would be involved in Europe first, that we would, when we asked Congress to declare war, we would be talking about, well, Germany did this or Italy did this. I don't think we thought that Japan was going to be the country that actually pulled us into World War II, but that's exactly what happens. And so down here, very important, Japan actually gets mad at us. We place an embargo on them. Not only had they invaded Manchuria, they were working their way down the eastern China coast, and they did not have a very conventional or traditional way of fighting. they were extremely brutal. And there are rules to war. I think we've discussed this before. There are rules to war, and Japan was not abiding by it. There were atrocious acts taking place, like the rape of Nanking and things like that. So to not go into too much detail, they were atrocious. And what we realized is the Japanese military, how they were fueling themselves with oil because they were an island and didn't have very many natural resources. They were getting it because they were trading with America. We were fueling their military. And so, because their aggression is so atrocious throughout Asia, we actually placed an embargo on them where not only are we going to not sell oil, steel, or any type of rubber either. We're going to cut off some very, very major resources needed for their military. And after we do this, Japan actually tries to be a little slick, and they try to tell us that they're going to stop and they're not going to continue these acts. They even send representatives to Washington, D.C. with peace medals, and we're meeting and trying to work on our relationship. And the whole entire time that they're doing that, they were actually planning the attack of Pearl Harbor. And on December 7th, 1941, very early in the morning, on a Sunday morning, Japan launches one of the most devastating attacks on American soil. The only other attack that comes close to this one, of course, is the attacks on 9/11 with the Twin Towers and the Pentagon and so on. So that is going to be what brings us into this war. Jumping over here to the side, you have to know these specific strategies that military-wise were used throughout World War II. So over here, let's make sure you understand that Blitzkrieg is something that the Germans use, and it's literally known as lightning war. This is very fast, aggressive attacks with waves of aircraft and then tanks and then your foot soldiers, okay? And it's very, very quickly, and that is how Hitler was able to take over the majority of Europe in such a short amount of time. Something that we had to use when we go to the Pacific to fight against Japan, because Japan's territory was spread so far and wide, we couldn't jump into Japan. We had to start from the outside and push back in. Well, they had so many islands in their possession that when we first started trying to work from one island and then go to the next and then go to the next, we realized it was taking way too long. So we create what's called the island hopping strategy, where we're not going to focus on every single island that is under Japanese possession. We're going to actually hop from island to island, and we're going to try to choose the islands that are not as heavily protected. And our goal is to hop to get close enough to Japan. We got to get close enough to Japan to invade and eliminate them as a threat. And then you have to know, it's specifically mentioned in your standard, what type of amphibious landings we had throughout World War II and the role that they had in the war. And guys, when you see amphibious landings, you better think, okay, that was D-Day. That was the invasion of Normandy when we finally create the Western Front in Europe. The mastermind behind that invasion is going to be General Eisenhower, and it's called an amphibious landing is because we had to invade from water to land. We had to go across the English Channel and invade the most northern part of France known as Normandy. Okay, so that was very, very important because it allowed us to create a Western Front. On this page, we got a little bit of a randomness that we've seen. You got to understand some major migration patterns that we had inside of the U.S. And what we're going to see here with this graph, all right, is we're going to see two migration patterns with this one, and they are the exact opposite of one another. And so that's a little odd. So right here, we're going to see a migration from the Rust Belt up here. It's called the Rust Belt because a lot of the factories that had produced war equipment in World War I, they were a little bit older and a little outdated. And we have built many new factories down here in the Sun Belt. So most migration takes place for the purpose of jobs. So this, again, leaving the Rust Belt up north and migrating down to the Sun Belt in the south. And a couple of things that made the Sun Belt a little bit more attractive is going to be the cost of living. It's cheaper to live down here, and also air conditioning. Air conditioning, that invention is going to make the heat a little bit more bearable. So now here we see, and you see it in the title there, we're going to have a second Great Migration, and specifically this is talking about African Americans. And they're going to be leaving the South, and they're going to be going to the North. And again, the number one reason are jobs. We're fixing to be drafting a whole bunch of soldiers, most of them being white, and we were going to be sending them to Europe, and it's going to open up a lot of job opportunities. So, as you can tell, with all these jobs, not only in the South and in the North, this is what brings us out of the Great Depression, obviously. We're going to see massive production for World War II, even before our involvement. Like when we were making war equipment for the cash and carry policy with Britain, and then the Lend-Lease policy, we were making war equipment. We're going to start to see our economy finally recover from the Great Depression. And you have your alliances up here. We are obviously going to be joining the Allied powers with Britain, France. France does get taken over by Hitler. The Soviet Union will join us after Hitler breaks that non-aggression pact with them, and then we join after Pearl Harbor. And then our enemy is going to be, the acronym is JIG, Japan, Italy, and Germany. Over here, you have to know, just like for World War I, the mobilization, how we got ready for war. And it's pretty much the same way that we did in World War I. So I think right here it's going to be mostly highlighting. We're going to see war production factories, and this is where a lot of factories are going to be contracted out by the government and turned into munitions factories. They're going to be producing war equipment. The National War Labor Board, again, the key word being labor, work. If we're producing war equipment, workers cannot go on strike. That was their job. So we're going to see increase in pay. We're going to see more power to unions throughout World War II. This is going to be a very good working environment, and a good working environment is going to be encouraged because we got to make sure they don't go on strike. We get something new here. We get what's called the Office of Price Administration. And the government is actually going to create this to not only make sure that we are rationing like we did in World War I, they want to make sure that prices don't get outrageous. And there might want to be a tendency to do that because you got to remember, we just come out of the Depression. A lot of these companies, if they made it through the Depression, have been struggling for nearly a decade at this point. And so they may see that now that the demand for these products are high, they may want to jack up their prices to accommodate for their loss during the Great Depression. So to make sure that that doesn't happen and prices don't get outrageous, the Office of Price Administration is going to set ceilings or caps on how much you can charge for certain items. And then same exact way that we're funded World War I, we're going to fund World War II. We're going to raise income taxes. And here's the big one: sell war bonds. That's the way we raise the most money for the first war, and that's going to be the way that we raise the most money for the second war. Again, we have the Office of War Information. In World War I, it was called the Committee on Public Information. These are the ones who make propaganda. The posters encouraging you to grow victory gardens, encouraging you to ration, encouraging men to join the military. All of you trying to get on the same page with supporting this war effort. We got something really, really new here, and it's important. The Office of Research and Development. This is specifically created for new technologies that we need in this war. Like this group, their job is to find a way to create new things that's going to give us an advantage in this war. So to kind of talk about some of the technology that was developed, I want to jot down, like we're going to get sonar. And sonar is going to help us detect those German U-boats under the water. And thanks to the sonar and our system of what's called the convoy system, where we protect our ships with bodyguards as they are traveling across the Atlantic, we're going to be able to successfully get to Europe to even fight the war. Something else that we're actually going to get from Britain is the radar. And we're going to tweak it and we're going to try to perfect it. And this is going to help us detect aircraft and things like that. And then, huge, I'm going to even change the color of my highlighter for this one. The Manhattan Project. The Manhattan Project was a top secret project that FDR is going to initiate after receiving a letter from Albert Einstein. And this is going to be a project to develop a weapon of mass destruction called an atomic bomb. And of course, the lead scientist in this project, his name was Robert Oppenheimer. And then obviously the same thing that we did, and we were already doing it because we started this in 1940. Our first peacetime draft is we're going to recruit soldiers through the draft. This slide right here is talking about the role that all these different minority groups had. So let's get through this. Women, pretty much the same as World War I, but we're going to see like a mascot. That's what I call her. The mascot, Rosie the Riveter. Here she is, okay? Was she an actual person? No. Again, she was a mascot to represent the working woman. How the woman is going to, again, have to get out of that traditional role of being the housewife, staying at home, cooking and cleaning, and she's fixing to have to go to work. We need war equipment being produced. And a lot of them are going to join the military, but just like World War I, only in non-combat positions. Like they could fly aircraft as long as it wasn't combat. They could do nurses or clerical work, secretaries and things. And here we're going to see a trend. A lot of women after World War II are going to remain in the workforce. They're not going to go home. So we're going to start to see a move away from that traditional role. And every decade since World War II, we have had more and more and more women step out of the house and go into the workforce. African Americans, we're going to see again another great migration like we did in World War I, where a lot of African Americans are going to leave the South and move up north for jobs in these munitions factories. A. Philip Randolph, he's going to be big in our civil rights movement. Him and Martin Luther King Jr. are going to work together to do like big protests, like the March on Washington and things like that. And A. Philip Randolph here, he's the leader of an all-black union. And he starts to notice that a lot of these black workers in these industries are being mistreated. They're being discriminated against because they were black. And they're being paid less and they're getting, some of the crappier jobs, I guess is the best way to say it. And so A. Philip Randolph is actually kind of slick here. He calls a meeting with FDR and basically tells FDR that African Americans needed to be treated equally in these industries, and if they weren't, then they may be inclined to lead a march on Washington, which means, they'll show up in Washington, D.C., just marching to encourage Congress to pass a law to help them out. He was really good to not say that they would go on strike. And we don't need workers going on strike during World War II because they're supposed to be producing war equipment, which we need to win. So he doesn't say we're going on strike. He just says we're gonna march on Washington. So FDR kind of receiving the message like, hey, I can either find a way to help these people or they're not going to be working and that's going to hurt us. He actually doesn't even put it in Congress's hands. He uses an executive order. He's like, this needs to be done right now. And his executive order creates the Fair Employment Practices Commission, which makes it to where there can be no discrimination. And I want to go ahead and find somewhere to jot that down. So we're going to come up here. No discrimination for blacks. This is important, in munitions factories. So all those factories that were contracted out by the government, they had to pay the blacks equally, they had to treat them equally, so on and so forth. Now what we're going to see is after this war, when there are no more munitions factories, that the Fair Employment Practices Commission is no longer going to exist. Those are no longer munitions factories, they're no longer under the authority of the government, so the discrimination will return after the war is over. The Double V campaign sometimes is credited with being the beginning of the civil rights movement. Sometimes we say that, sometimes we say it was Rosa Parks. But the Double V campaign is the African Americans that were drafted and volunteered to fight. They're going to say, we're going to have two victories. That's where Double V comes from. We're going to have victory over hate and racism in Europe, over Hitler. And then when we come back to America, we're going to start to have that victory here as well. A key players in World War II were the Tuskegee Airmen. They were escorts, and they were very, 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 very good at their job. And at first, they were not welcomed, obviously, because they were African American. But once they proved themselves to be effective, most white pilots that needed escorts were asking for the Tuskegee Airmen to take care of them. And again, just like World War I, we're going to see that they had to fight in segregated units. Now, let's go ahead and get this. Make sure you note, this will end after World War II. Harry Truman is going to be our president at the end of this war. And what we're going to see is one thing that he will do when World War II is over is he will use an executive order, again, not asking Congress. He's going to use an executive order to desegregate the armed forces. So we have not forced segregation in our military since World War II. Native Americans, specifically the Navajo. We're going to be using the Navajo in the Pacific for code talkers. The Japanese were very, very good at breaking our codes of communication, where we would try to surprise attack them in places, but when we were communicating over the radio, we would have to speak in code, thinking that we were communicating, and they had no idea what we were doing. And they were just really, really good at breaking our codes. We were not as good at breaking theirs. So what we're going to see is we're going to bring in some people that speak a different language, and it's the Navajo. And what they have is called an unwritten language, where only a handful of the Navajo could still even speak it, and nobody outside of the tribe could comprehend it. So we bring these Navajo code talkers to the Pacific, and we give them the radio, and we make them start communicating with one another, and of course translating to the people that they are with to English. And all of a sudden the Japanese, while they're listening in, they start hearing these Navajo code talkers, and they don't know what's going on. They cannot break the code. So to be honest with you, these code talkers, they play a huge role in our success in the Pacific, simply because of the language that they speak. Mexican Americans at home are going to be heavily discriminated against because of something called the Zoot Suit riots. This is going to be a popular trend amongst the Mexican American community out in California, where it's a suit, but the suit was baggy, so it required more fabric. And I always tell my classes, I try to just teach it how it really is as much as I possibly can. In Los Angeles, there was a naval base there, so there's a lot of white Navy men, and there's a large Mexican-American community that are wearing these new popular suits that's popular amongst them, obviously. And the Navy men look at these suits as being unpatriotic and hurting the war effort, because, you're supposed to be rationing. You're not supposed to be taking an excess of anything. And because of the amount of fabric that is used to make these zoot suits, they are not supporting the war effort. And this is where the reality comes into it. The reality was, to be honest with you, they didn't really have a problem with the suit. It was a racist problem. They had a problem with a person that was wearing the suit. If it had been a popular trend amongst white men, nothing would have been said, okay? And that's just the reality of it. So the Zoot Suit riots are going to break out. Those Navy men are going to start attacking any Mexican American that they see, beating them, literally snatching the suits off their bodies and things like that. As far as in the military, like the African Americans, they did have to fight in segregated units. And in this one, the Bracero program, okay? The Bracero program is, I've mentioned it in a past unit, kind of when we've been that toxic X with Mexico, where during the Great Depression, a lot of Mexican immigrants that had come to help us grow food during World War I, and they stayed. Well, when they had jobs during the Great Depression, we deported them. We sent them back to Mexico to open up those jobs for white Americans. And now that World War II has broken out and we need help growing food again, we invite them back through the Bracero program. So we're going to see Mexican immigrants crossing the border, coming to America to help us grow food to support the war effort. Now, out of all the things on this page right here, I can tell you the most important by far is going to be the role that Japanese Americans had in World War II. It's no secret, Japan bombed Pearl Harbor and killed over 2,000 Americans. And there is going to be a stereotype after that when an Asian is seen, especially if you know that they were a Japanese American, they could have been an American citizen. They could have been born and raised here, but they are from a Japanese descent. There is going to be some stereotyping there. And so what we're going to see is a lot of Japanese Americans are going to be mistreated. They're going to be called Japs. That was kind of the derogatory term to call them. And something a little odd is going to happen. What we're going to realize is because Pearl Harbor was bombed by Japan, and Japan did a really good job hitting the targets in Pearl Harbor, they did a really good job because they had spies in Hawaii taking pictures of the harbor every day, and they knew how our ships were set up, and that is the reason their attack was so effective. So if there were spies in Hawaii, the next target is our West Coast. Think California. And there was a large Japanese American community along that West Coast. And some of them could have been spies. So FDR is going to use an executive order because, again, some things need to be done immediately. You don't have time to wait. When we realize that those Japanese Americans on our West Coast could potentially be spies, they're a threat. So we got to get them away, and it's got to be done very quickly. And he's going to have over 100,000 Japanese Americans, the majority of them being born and raised American citizens. He's going to have them removed from the West Coast and placed in internment camps, aka prison camps, away from the West Coast. One of these men who was in this 100,000 and was rounded up and put in these internment camps. Again, think of it as prisons. He's going to realize that this is a violation of his rights as an American citizen. And his last name was Korematsu, which obviously sounds Japanese. His first name was Fred. And I don't know if it gets much more American than that, but his name was Fred Korematsu, born and raised in America, but because he was of Japanese descent, he was seen as a potential threat and put in these internment camps. Well, he's like, no, you can't do that. That's a violation of my rights. And again, as we've discussed in past units, this is a running theme in this classroom. Your rights don't matter if the government says you're a threat to national security. So his effort with the Supreme Court of trying to get his freedom outside of these internment camps because there was no evidence against him that he had done anything wrong, they're going to say, no, you have to stay along with everybody else in these internment camps, and for the sake of national security. And they will stay in these internment camps until the end of the war. Now, sometimes, and I just want to use this because it is state test terminology, sometimes the Supreme Court is said to have kept them in these internment camps because it was a military necessity. Okay, it's a military necessity to get them away from our West Coast so that we were sure to not have any spies on that West Coast. So to proceed with this unit on World War II, on this page we're going to see that I've got some detailed information about Franklin Roosevelt and some important conferences that we see during World War II. So let's break all of these down. With Franklin Roosevelt, it is important for you to understand, and I know I keep saying that, it is important, it really is, that he will be our president throughout the majority of the Great Depression and the majority of World War II. And this is a little bit of a spoiler. He winds up passing away in his fourth term. And so I'm going to jump down here and highlight that. He's elected 4 times. And the word that's often used to describe that is unprecedented, which means it had never been done before. His third term was unprecedented. No president had ever been elected for a third term. Now, after his passing, we're going to see that the states are going to agree on amending the Constitution and adding the 22nd Amendment. And the 22nd Amendment is what limits a presidency to 2 terms. Just a quick reminder up here, with his good neighbor policy, the good neighbor policy is where we didn't want to wind up like we didn't want to wind up like Europe with all of the problems between the countries in Europe. Over here with Latin America, we wanted to establish a better relationship. So we signed the good neighbor policy. So I do want you to know that is with Latin America. They are our neighboring countries. And then, of course, when he asked Congress to declare war, the kind of this introduction to his asking, he talks about December 7th, 1941, which, of course, is the day that we get bombed by at Pearl Harbor. He calls that a date which will live in infamy. And that word infamy means like it's going to be very well known. We're not going to forget it, but it's going to be known for its tragedy. So make sure that what he's talking about here is December 7th, 1941. He is going to choose Harry Truman to be his vice president throughout his 4th term, and that is going to result in, since FDR passes away in his 4th term, Harry Truman will be stepping into the presidency and seeing us through the end of World War II. A little recap here. He did issue an executive order when A. Philip Randolph comes in and talks about how African Americans were being discriminated against them in war industries. So A. Philip Randolph is going to convince FDR to pass an executive order to end discrimination. And if you kind of remember, that discrimination will continue once World War II is over. And then something we talked about just in the last slide is another executive order, 9066. And if you remember, executive orders are used because sometimes we don't have time for the president to ask Congress to do something. Sometimes things need to be done immediately. And so this executive order is when we saw that the Japanese Americans living on our West Coast could potentially be spies like we had in Hawaii. And we are going to, out of a military necessity, need to remove them from our West Coast and put them in internment camps, which you can think of that as being like prison. And he will die on April 12th, 1945, which is just a month shy before we win the war in Europe. And then, of course, like I mentioned earlier, since Truman was his vice president, he will step into the presidency and see us through the end of this war. Now, these conferences, there are many conferences that are held throughout World War II, and a lot of these, some of these are honestly more important than others, but we're going to kind of break down the most important parts of each one. The Munich Conference, that is where the League of Nations met with Hitler prior to World War I, when Hitler was doing all the things that he wasn't supposed to be doing. He was violating the Treaty of Versailles and things like that. And they meet with him, and this is where they follow the policy of appeasement. And they give Hitler specifically the Sudetenland, which is a part of Czechoslovakia. And they're under the impression that Hitler was going to be satisfied, and we know that he was not. He will wind up taking over the rest of Czechoslovakia, and then shortly after that, invading Poland, which is actually what started World War II. The Wannsee Conference, I'm assuming I'm saying that correct, but this was a Nazi-only meeting. And this is where the Nazis gathered together. They had all those steps that they took to get to the Holocaust, where at first, it was just discrimination with the Nuremberg laws. And then there was immigration laws asking them to leave the country of Germany. And then there were segregation where they were put into ghettos away from his German citizens. And then we know the final solution was the concentration camps with the plans of exterminating the Jewish race. And that, again, is genocide. So at the Wannsee Conference, this is where the final solution to the Jewish problem was decided, and that's where we get the Holocaust from. The Casablanca Conference, again, I'm assuming, I'm probably not, but I'm hoping I'm saying these right. This is going to be between Churchill and FDR. Now, Stalin could not attend this meeting. At this point in time, he has been betrayed by Hitler with the Non-Aggression Pact. Hitler has invaded the Soviet Union, and we are in an alliance with Stalin fighting against Hitler. But he cannot come because he's a little preoccupied with the Nazis in his country at the moment. And we're going to kind of take advantage of that because at this time we have liberated North Africa and we have to decide where we're going to enter into Europe at. And we have a choice. We can enter in through the south, what's called the soft underbelly of Europe, through Italy, or we can go up to England and invade the northern part of Europe, which would be through France, Normandy to be specific, and go ahead and create that Western Front. Now we are going to decide, without Stalin being there, that we are going to enter in through the south first. And this, you can see that bottom note right there, this decision infuriates Joseph Stalin. First and foremost, because he was not there and he was not made a part of this choice. But the reason he was mad, and I want to go ahead and make note of this, he wanted a Western Front so Nazis would have to divide. That's how we're going to sum it up there. If you're in my class, you know, because we've said it during World War I and World War II, the odds of you winning a war fought on two fronts is not very high. So what this would have done, the reason he wanted a Western Front is Germany is fighting on their Eastern Front. They are fighting against the Soviet Union. They don't have much going on their Western Front because they easily took over France. All they have over there on the Western Front is Britain, and they're an island, so they're kind of away from the Western Front just a bit. So, since there's so much fighting on the Eastern Front, if we would have created that Western Front, Hitler would have had to have removed some of his forces from the Soviet Union to go fight on that Western Front. You know, you kind of got the old saying, divide and conquer. You divide up your enemy, and they're going to be weaker, and you're going to be able to conquer them. And that's what Stalin wanted, but that's not what we did first. We decided to come up through Italy. We are going to see, with the General Patton, we're going to come up through Italy, and we are going to push Mussolini out of his own country, to be honest with you. He'll wind up being captured and killed by some of his own people to kind of shorten up that story a bit. And then, so let's move on to the next conference here. It's called the Terran Conference. And this is where the big three are going to meet. And we're often called the big three. And that's going to be Winston Churchill with Britain, FDR with the United States, and Joseph Stalin with the Soviet Union. And this is after we've come in through Southern Europe. This is where the decision is made that we will create that Western Front. We're going to invade Normandy. Now, This is where some students get confused, okay? When we say we are invading France here, the most northern part of France is what we're calling this Normandy. Students kind of get confused. They're like, wait, I thought France was our ally, and they are, but they were conquered by the Nazis. So when we're invading France here, we're not necessarily invading our ally, France. We are invading Nazi-occupied France. So that is important in understanding that we are not, what happened? Uh-oh. Let me get back to it. We are not invading our ally. Okay, excuse me for that. And so we also decided that we would be accepting only what is referred to as an unconditional surrender from Italy and Germany. And what that means is sometimes in war, when one side is considering to surrender and give up, they will contact who they are fighting and they will say, okay, well, we will surrender if you promise to do this, this, and this when this war is over. You know, basically make things not so tough on us or do this. And what we're saying here is there will be no conditions put on their surrender. They will surrender unconditionally, and we will be the ones who make all the decisions. Moving on to another conference, we are going to have what's known as the Yalta Conference. And the Yalta Conference is very important, not just in this unit, but in the next unit. And this is, again, a meeting between the big three. And we're going to see that is Churchill, FDR, and Stalin. And this is what we're going to decide to do post-World War II. So technically the war isn't fully over. But we're already making plans on what are we going to do when this is over? What are we going to do about rebuilding Europe? What are we going to do about Germany after Hitler is gone? What are we going to do about Japan? Like, all these decisions have to be made. So we're just kind of starting to divvy off in some of these ideas and these plans that we have. So one thing that we're going to decide to do is actually divide up Germany, which we'll see on the next slide. Or it's going to be in a few slides. But we're going to divide up Germany for multiple reasons. We're going to divide up Germany because Germany, at the end of World War II, was ultimately destroyed. Okay, especially the bigger cities like the capital of Berlin. We're going to see Germany not only has been destroyed, but there were still some very, very prominent Nazis that fully supported Hitler in Germany. So we're going to divide up Germany amongst the four allied powers. It's going to be the Soviet Union, the United States, Britain, and France. And we are going to divide it up so that we can help rebuild Germany as well as monitor them post-World War II. We actually don't just divide up Germany, the whole country. We even take their capital, Berlin, and divide it up as well. Right here, the next one, it says, promise to allow free elections in all liberated, which means freed countries after the war. All those countries that the Nazis, that Hitler had taken over, that we pushed out, we are going to say and claim, all of us, especially Joseph Stalin, the countries that he liberated, we're going to let them, when this is all over, we're going to let them vote. That's what free elections are. We're going to let them vote. We're going to let them choose their government. We're going to let them choose their leaders. This is where I want you to write. I'm going to change colors, and I'm going to write this in red because it's all about the Soviet Union and communism. Okay? Specifically, the country that I want you to know about. I want you to know that Stalin really promised this for the country of Poland. It's going to promise them free elections. Another way of saying it is self-determination, letting them choose. And what we're going to learn is not only for Poland, but all of those other countries that the Soviet Union liberated, that he is not going to allow them free elections. He's actually going to force them to be communist, and that's going to roll into our next unit, which is the Cold War. The Soviet Union does promise us here that after the war is over in Europe, that they will help us fight Japan after 3 months. Okay, so after the war's over in Europe, the Soviet Union will regather themselves for 3 months, and then they'll actually come across and help us defeat Japan. And that's going to play a huge role in getting Japan to surrender at the end of this war. Also, we decide to create a United Nations, which we do join, and we no longer follow a policy of isolationism. We will never return to a policy of isolationism. We are extremely active in world affairs, okay, and promoting peace and preventing wars, and we do that with other groups of countries that are a part of the United Nations. And for the first time ever at this conference, there is going to be something called war crimes being punished. And these war crimes, specifically for the Nazis, are going to be held in a courtroom in Nuremberg, which is in Germany, and we are going to put a lot of the men involved with the Holocaust, a lot of the men involved with like higher ranking officials in Hitler's military. We are going to put them on trial and hold them accountable for the atrocious things that they did during World War II. And again, if you've been in my class, we've discussed this. There, in war there is killing, and that is obvious. But believe it or not, there is a right way and there is a wrong way. And there are rules to war. And we're going to see that not only do the Nazis, in typical warfare and the Holocaust, the Japanese as well, they did not follow these rules. And we're going to want to make sure that the message is sent after World War II, that they're not suggestions, that there are expectations, and there is an etiquette to war, and it must be followed. If not, it will be punished. And then towards the very end of the war, at this point in time, FDR has passed away, and Truman has stepped into the presidency. And he is meeting, okay, and it's called the Potsdam Conference. And this is a meeting between the big three. And what we're going to see is it's going to be Truman, because, again, Roosevelt has passed away. Churchill is going to be replaced with Attlee. Right after the war's over in Europe, Churchill's going to kind of be booted out of the prime minister position for a while. And what we're going to see is this is where, and of course Stalin, I don't understand why his name isn't there. Let's write that down. And Stalin. And it's in red, so that's perfect. This is where Truman is actually going to receive word that the Manhattan Project has been a success, and that we have developed 3 atomic weapons. One of them has already been tested. We tested it out in the middle of New Mexico, kind of out in the middle of nowhere, and it was a success. It was a success, and it's ready to go. So Oppenheimer gets the word to Truman, you've got 2 weapons of mass destruction. They're yours. You decide how to use those. And so Truman is faced with a very difficult decision. At this point in time, with our island hopping strategy, we have got close enough to Japan to invade Japan. And Japan had started not only, of course, preparing their military for a land invasion, they had actually started preparing their civilians for a land invasion as well. And so we're gonna have our hands full if we invade Japan. We're going to be fighting everybody. It's going to be devastating, not just for them. It's going to be devastating for American soldiers as well. So, hoping to kind of send a message to Japan, because in their minds, we're about to invade. They have no idea that we have these weapons. Truman is going to make what I tell my students like a public announcement, where he is going to ask Japan to surrender, and if not, and here are the words that he used, you need to surrender or you're going to face complete and utter destruction. And of course, Japan, again, not knowing we have these weapons, are not very concerned. They're basically kind of like, bring it on. Their military mindset is the last thing we're going to do is surrender. And again, how we're going to respond is not how they intended. We did not invade Japan. Truman will make the decision, and we'll talk about how and specifically why he chooses to go this route instead of a land invasion. But Truman is going to ultimately decide to use these atomic weapons on Japan. And we're going to drop one. And I can't remember. We drop them on Nagasaki, and some people say Hiroshima or Hiroshima. And we dropped one, and Japan didn't surrender. And right after we dropped the first one, the Soviet Union is actually going to do what they told us over here. I'm just going to kind of circle it. The Soviet Union said, hey, give us 3 months and we will help you fight Japan. The Soviet Union is going to declare war on Japan. So if you're kind of in Japan's shoes, you just got hit with a weapon unlike anything the world has ever seen before. It killed over 100,000 people on impact, and it was just one bomb. And then now the Soviet Union's declared war against them, and then a couple of days later, we drop a second bomb. And of course, we knew we were out. Japan had no clue that we were out of atomic weapons, and we kind of bluffed, you know. We didn't want them to know. We wanted them to kind of think that we've got a whole arsenal of these weapons, and we'll just keep bringing them and keep bringing them and keep bringing them. And ultimately, thank goodness, the emperor is going to, he will surrender for Japan. The next couple of slides, we're going to be talking about the war in what we call the two theaters. On this slide here, we have the European theater. So this is the war that we're fighting against Germany and Italy. And then on the next slide, we're going to have what's called the Pacific theater, the one that we're going to be fighting against Japan. I want to bring your attention up here to this box. It is covering what we're going to call important generals that we have during World War II. The two important generals that we're going to have here in the European theater are General Patton. And one thing that Patton is known for is his tank tactics that he's going to use. And he's going to be a part of the North African campaign. And so he's going to be responsible for, down here at the very bottom of the screen where you see North Africa, for pushing the Axis powers out of that part of Africa. And then when we go to enter into Europe through Italy, he's going to be leading that charge. And then another important general, the mastermind behind creating what we're going to call the Western Front, is General Eisenhower. And that Western Front is often referred to in this country as D-Day, and the invasion of Normandy. All right, so I have them numbered here based off of the order that they happened in. The first battle that we have got to win is actually called the Battle of the Atlantic. And as we are sending our troops and our supplies to Europe, the biggest threat that we are going to experience in the water are going to be the German U-boats, just like we experienced in World War I. And there's going to be two techniques, and well, I say two techniques, one technique and one technology that's going to help make this successful for us. We are going to yet again use the convoy system, which you think of the convoy system as being like, I tell my students, it's just like being bodyguards. And this is where our ships are going to have escorts across the Atlantic, okay? And then a technology that's going to help us detect the German U-boats is going to be sonar. So between the convoy system and the sonar, it's going to be fairly easy for us to safely make it to Europe despite the German U-boats. The second battle that is going to play a huge role in Europe is over here in the Soviet Union, called the Battle of Stalingrad. So make sure you remember that Hitler had formed the non-aggression pact with Stalin, but he's broken that at this point. He invaded the Soviet Union in 1941 and has pretty much wreaked havoc through the country. The Battle of Stalingrad is going to be what we call and I'm going to write it down, a turning point. And this is called a turning point battle because at this moment, the Nazis had pretty much been just flowing through the Soviet Union. And it's at this battle where their advance through the Soviet Union is going to stop. And we're going to see that Stalin is going to begin to push the Nazis back. All right, so that Eastern Front After the Battle of Stalingrad, we're going to see he is going to slowly start pushing the Nazis back. Another important battle, jumping down here through that North Africa campaign, is the Battle of El Alamein. And this is going to be, again, where we are successfully pushing out the Axis powers from that territory that they had gained throughout North Africa. And at a conference known as, and I'm probably butchering it, the Casablanca Conference, Stalin is going to get mad. And part of the reason he's going to be mad is because he was not able to attend this conference. The Battle of Stalingrad had taken a huge toll on him, and his presence was needed in his country, so he couldn't attend this, which only left Winston Churchill and FDR at this meeting, and the decision was being made, where are we going to enter into Europe at now that we've pushed the Axis powers out of North Africa? Are we going to come in through the bottom, the soft underbelly, through Italy, or are we going to create a Western front over in France and push them out of France first? Well, what we decide really does make Stalin mad. And this is where we decide that we are going to leave North Africa and continue our trek through Italy. And then as we're going through Italy, that's where Mussolini is going to meet his end. And ultimately, and you can look up pictures yourself, he's going to be hung upside down by, like on a bridge, him and his mistress, in their attempt to flee the country, all right? So that's going to bring an end to Mussolini in Italy. Next battle, so that was number 3, 4 is Casablanca. 5 is going to be, we're going to meet at another conference. Stalin will be there. And since we have already invaded through the soft underbelly, we're finally going to give Stalin what he needs and what he wants, and that is that Western Front. And this is, again, often called D-Day. The code name for this is going to be Operation Overlord, and the mastermind, yet again, behind this is going to be General Eisenhower. Now, what this is, and this can be confusing to some students, is we are going to be leaving Britain up here, who is our ally, and we are going to be crossing over the English Channel, invading France, who again is our ally. So my students often get confused. They're like, why in the world are we invading our ally? And we are invading France because though they are our ally, at this point, they are controlled by the Nazis. Nazis is going to control the majority of this country. When they invaded France in 1940, they easily took over the capital of Paris. And so when we're invading France here, we're not invading our ally. We're invading Nazi-occupied France. And again, this is called the invasion of Normandy. That can be confusing as well. This most northern part of France, it's called Normandy. And with a little bit of trickery and, using some like fake tanks and fake balloons and getting Hitler to kind of pull some of his troops away from Normandy, we're going to be able to successfully invade 7 different beaches along that French coast there. And it's going to be successful, but please do not confuse this with being we wiped them out. There was major loss of life through this invasion of Normandy, this D-Day. And so now what we're seeing is, again, and I'm just going to kind of circle this with a highlighter for you to see, the Soviet Union is pushing the Nazis from the east, okay? We are continuing, to push from the south. And now that we have done this invasion of Normandy, now we're pushing them from the west. That's that Western Front there. And in the military, they would call this kind of the pincer maneuver. You can think of it as like being pinched, where Germany and Italy had spread far and wide. Now we are pushing them back from all sides. And ultimately, the last little attempt that Hitler will make to push us out is going to be called the Battle of the Bulge. And it's called the Battle of the Bulge because he's going to launch this massive counterattack. We will see a major bulge in our front lines where they had the Nazis had limited success, but ultimately at this time in the war, we're going to overcome this. And as we approach, and I'm going to kind of just add this in here, okay, as we approach the capital of Germany, which is right here where this dot is, Berlin, Hitler is hiding in an underground bunker, and as the Soviet Union actually approaches him, he is going to end his life. And the people that he kind of transfers his authority over to, they will be the ones who surrender for Germany. And after that surrender, this is where we get VE Day, the victory in Europe. But the war isn't over. Okay, the war isn't over because we have the Pacific Theater still going on. So, some important battles in the Pacific Theater. Actually, before we get to those battles, let's talk about the important generals. The important general that you have to know is General Douglas MacArthur. And he is going to be stationed specifically in the Philippines for a while until he is forced to evacuate. And this is also the part of the war where we have to use the island hopping strategy. Now, the goal is, I'm going to go ahead and highlight them here. We are fighting Japan, but Japan has pretty much spread their, and that's a little excessive, but they have spread their land throughout all these different islands. And so we can't just jump right into Japan. We're going to have to pick and choose certain islands to hop through to get close enough to it. Okay? Let me see if I can clear some of this off so it's less confusing here in a second. So, goal is to get to Japan through that island hopping strategy. First one, of course, was important, is where we were attacked at Pearl Harbor, which is what kickstarts that war. Again, that date was December 7th, 1941, and immediately after attacking us at Pearl Harbor, they're going to actually turn around and attack us in the Philippines. And the Philippines was a U.S. territory. We gained the Philippines after the Spanish-American War, and this is where General Douglas MacArthur was actually stationed. And because of the hit that our Navy took in Hawaii, when they turn around and hit us immediately in the Philippines, there's not any help coming. And so they're easily going to overcome us. And General Douglas MacArthur was actually going to stay there with his men and be overcome. He most likely would have been executed by the Japanese, but FDR is going to give him an order where he is going to have to abandon his men. He's actually going to have to abandon his men, and he will be forced to come down here to Australia, which had not been taken over by Japan, and he's going to stay in Australia as we fight this war in the Pacific, okay, until he can do what he promises, and he is going to promise to return to the Philippines and get it back. Now, something that happens in the Philippines that really, really gets our attention after this war is how our POWs were treated in something called the Bataan Death March. And this is when the Japanese got American POWs, some of the Filipinos, and they're going to march them to a concentration camp in the most northern part of the island there. And it's horrendous how these POWs are treated. I have mentioned before, there are rules to war. The Japanese were very well known for not following those rules throughout Asia, and this is going to be a prime example. But there are human rights that every person in this world should have, even doesn't matter who you are, where you are, what country, what government, what authority you're under. It doesn't even matter if you're a POW, okay? So what we're going to see here, this is a good place to write this. This is going to encourage us to protect human rights. after this war is over. That peacekeeping organization called the United Nations that we discussed forming after this war, it will be formed. And one of the things that we are going to target is basic human rights being protected for everybody. All right. Now, what we get is after the attack at the Philippines, the next major battle you need to be familiar with. So let's find number 3 is we kind of sneak on a carrier ship. That's the reason I have this little battleship there. We actually sneak a little carrier ship to close enough to Japan to do a few bombing campaigns over the island. This is going to have very limited success because we could launch from this carrier ship, but we could not land on it. So some of our aircraft in these Doolittle raids is they're going to crash or land over here in China. But the problem is many of their crash or landing sites were under territory that the Japanese had conquered. And so some of those people are going to be killed. They're going to be turned into more POWs. So again, the Doolittle raids, we're going to have major success here. And rumor has it that this is where we return those peace medals that they gave us before they bombed us at Pearl Harbor. So I don't know how true that is, but rumor is that we taped them to the bombs in these Doolittle raids. So the 4th major battle is down here, the Battle of Coral Sea, and this is going to keep Japan from taking over Australia. And then Battle of Midway. That is a very important battle. And this, again, is going to be what we call a turning point battle in the Pacific. At this point, Japan has been able to pretty much stretch as far and wide as they want to, and they were actually on their way to surprise attack us at Midway. And Midway was an island that we had some Navy reinforcements at, and they thought that they were coming to surprise attack us, but conveniently we had actually just broken their code. And while they were on their way, and they were bringing, how I explain it to my students, is they were bringing the house with them. So they're bringing pretty much the best that they've got in their Navy, and we decide that we're going to play dumb. We don't want them to know that we have cracked their code yet, but before they make it to Midway, instead of them actually surprise attacking us, we surprise attack them. And it is devastating to their Japanese fleet. And from that moment, because of the devastation on their fleet, we're going to be able to start pushing Japan back. And that island hopping strategy is going to be more effective. The next one, locate down here, the Battle of Leyte Gulf. And this is going to be the largest naval battle in American history. And this is what's going to allow MacArthur to return to the Philippines and get that back under American possession. Now, one thing we will do after this war is we will no longer control the Philippines as a U.S. territory. We will actually grant them their independence. Moving on to two very, very, very important battles. The Battle of Iwo Jima. Oops, meant to highlight that. Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Now, Iwo Jima is going to be an island around this area here. It's a very small island, but the significance is from this island, we can actually launch air raids over Japan. So we can leave Iwo Jima, fly over Japan and bomb them, and turn around and land. We'll have enough fuel to do that. So like the problem we had with the Doolittle raids, where we launched off of the carriers and bombed Japan, we didn't have anywhere safe to land that wasn't under Japanese territory. Well, this island here is close enough to launch, bomb Japan, and come back and land safely. So that's awesome. I will say, I should add this picture in here. This is a very famous picture of, it looks like this hill, and you got all these American soldiers on it, and they're kind of working to like raise the American flag. That is going to be the raising of the flag here on Iwo Jima. And so again, that's huge. And even better, from there, we're going to get the battle where we take over an island very close to Japan of Okinawa. And its significance is, at this point, we've hopped close enough to Japan. We plan to do a land invasion. And Okinawa is going to be the island that we're going to be able to launch that land invasion from. It's close enough. So, the thing about it is, we are not going to have to do a land invasion, because in the midst of this, FDR has passed away, Truman has taken over, and he has received word from the Manhattan Project that our atomic bombs are ready to go. We created 3. We tested one. It was called Project Trinity. We tested one out in the middle of the desert in New Mexico. It was a major success. We have 2 more ready to go. And so this is going to be where Truman has to make a very tough decision. But ultimately, he will choose to bomb Nagasaki and Hiroshima in Japan. These were not the most heavily populated areas. There was military significance to them. They were industries there, war industries, but these bombs are going to be devastating. Truman does try to get them to surrender. We talked about that in the Potsdam Conference. He tells them, like, hey, please surrender or face complete and utter destruction. Well, Japan, of course, just preparing for a land invasion and not knowing about the atomic bombs, they did not surrender. So we dropped the first bomb. They don't surrender. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, immediately after dropping of the first bomb on Japan, they do like they promised, and they declare war on Japan. They promised, they said, hey, give us 3 months after the war is over in Europe, and we will come over and help y'all fight in Japan. So think about Japan here. They've gotten bombed with something that they've never even come close to seeing before. Then the Soviet Union declares war on them. Still don't surrender. A couple of days later, we drop another bomb on another city, and eventually they will do an unconditional surrender. And that is going to lead to what's called VJ Day, which is Victory Over Japan. And now the war is over. Talking about the end of this war, one of your standards states that you have to understand Truman's decision to drop the atomic bombs, because he had a choice. We could have invaded Japan by land and fought a traditional war, or he could have used these atomic bombs in hopes that they would have surrendered, and they did. So the reason he chose to use the bombs, there's 3, okay, and they all are connected. Number 1, he wanted to save American lives. He firmly believed that if we invaded Japan, that there would have been a horrendous amount of American soldiers killed in that type of war. And then number 2 is also connected that had we launched a land invasion, not only would a lot of us been killed, but a lot of Japanese would have been killed as well. So he also believed that these bombs, if they did contribute to a surrender, would save Japanese lives as well. And of course, he believed that this is the quickest way to get the surrender, that we would have had to fight tooth and nail through Japan. And again, he believes that we would have had to have killed the majority of the country before they would have surrendered, which again connects to saving Japanese lives and things like that. And then another part of the standard is, and it's pretty easy, why people criticize his decision. And people ultimately criticized him because of the devastation of these bombs. That these bombs killed hundreds of thousands, at least 100,000 people on impact, both of them apiece, and that could have been prevented, okay? And again, bombs don't discriminate, because it didn't matter, the age or the person or who it was. If you were within the blast radius of this bomb, you were affected by it. So, of course, there were women and children and things like that. So, again, he's heavily criticized because not only did he kill hundreds of thousands of people with these 2 bombs, he kind of also opened up the door to what we're going to call the arms race in the Cold War, which immediately follows World War II. Down here at the bottom, please don't forget that Germany was divided after World War II. That's important for you to understand, especially in the next unit, where to show you how it was divided. Okay, and again, this is just kind of a rough draft here. On this side of Germany, we have the Soviet Union. This was their sector, the USA. Here is France, their sector, and Britain. Several reasons why we chose to divide up Germany after World War II. One reason was to monitor them. There was still a lot of Nazi support in the region. Number two is Germany was devastated. And we don't want to punish Germany like we did after World War I. We've kind of learned that lesson with the Treaty of Versailles. We not only want to monitor them, but we're actually going to kind of be responsible for rebuilding our sector. And so not only did we divide up Germany, if you remember over here, we split up the capital of Germany, which was Berlin, as well. And the thing about that is Berlin is located in the Soviet Union's sector, but it was divided pretty much the same way that we split up Germany here. Over here, we do create that peacekeeping organization that was discussed between FDR and Winston Churchill in the Atlantic Charter. We create the United Nations. And again, this is going to replace the League of Nations. It is still in effect today. And their job is to protect human rights, to maintain peace, to prevent war. They kind of dive off into a lot of different areas. Now, the role that we play in the United Nations is we are actually on something called the Security Council. And how the Security Council works, there's technically 15 countries on the Security Council, and 5 of the countries are permanent members. That means that they don't ever rotate off of this. I kind of call the Security Council a team. And we are one of those 5 permanent members, okay? So I want you to make sure you know that. 5 permanent members. We are one of those 5. It's us, China, Russia, Britain, and France, I believe. And the problem is whenever somebody addresses the United Nations, like if they're asking the United Nations for help in a conflict with war or something like that, they will address these 5 countries. And one power that all of these 5 countries have is to veto. They can veto any discussion brought to them. And that's going to really play a role in the Cold War when some discussions are going to be brought up about the Soviet Union. But if the Soviet Union is at the meeting, they simply veto the discussion and it's thrown out. Okay, so that is kind of a weird little thing that we put in there, but it is something how it works. Well, the United Nations is going to, and I'm going to jump down and I'll come back up. The United Nations is actually going to hold something called the Genocide Convention. And the reason that the United Nations pays attention to genocide, something happened in World War II that's really going to get their attention to address this. And remember, that's going to be the Holocaust. So the Holocaust is going to contribute to this convention. And this is where the United Nations, it says, adopts a decree to take a proactive approach in preventing genocide. There's actually 130 countries that have signed this to make sure that something like Hitler trying to wipe out the Jewish population, that things like that don't happen again. So thanks to the Holocaust, we get the Genocide Convention, and we actively pursue any attempts towards genocide across the world. Something else that the United Nations is going to participate in is being a part of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I just talked about this on the slide before. And the reason that we have this is because of the Bataan Death March. And this is where, again, the United Nations, these countries that are a part of this peacekeeping organization, they are going to state that all humans have certain freedoms and rights, despite who they are. And the United Nations will take an active approach in protecting those human rights. So if you see over here, it says all of these, and I'm fixing to go back and hit on the Nuremberg trials, all of these are going to be brought up because of some of the atrocities throughout World War II, like the Holocaust and the Bataan Death March, all right? Now, to kind of go back, make sure we don't miss it, we get the Nuremberg trials. And these Nuremberg trials are different because we kind of all understand that there's going to be some ugly parts of war. Of course, there are killings and things like that. And examples of total war, like World War I and World War II, it's not going to be killing just of like soldiers. You know, people, innocent civilians are going to be targeted, and that's just a part of it. But again, there are rules to war. And if there are rules, there's also, when those rules are going to be broken, this is where we're going to get war crimes. And never before this war had anybody been held accountable for crimes that were committed during war. Well, we're going to set an example. And we're not only going to set an example with the Nazis, we'll also do this with some of the Japanese, like the military dictator Hideki Tojo. He's going to be put on trial for crimes that he committed during war, and he will be executed. The emperor will not, but the military dictator of Japan will. But the Nuremberg trials, Nuremberg is located in Germany, will actually go in and rebuild a courtroom, and we're going to bring in judges from Britain and France and the United States, and we're going to put some of the most, I don't want to say important, but some of the lead figures in the Nazi army on trial for things that they did during the war that are considered war crimes. And you can kind of see the original numbers there. It says 24 were being prosecuted, 2 actually committed suicide before they were put on trial, 3 were acquitted, 19 actually convicted of the war crimes, and of the 19 that were convicted, the war crimes that they committed, only 12 of them were actually sentenced to death. But again, the significance of the Nuremberg trials, make sure you know it. I'm going to go ahead and write it right here. The significance is, this is the first time anyone was put on trial for war crimes. All right, and that should wrap up